So you mentioned a few times the idea of passive
recording
safety.
has started.
I know with nuclear engineering students that may be a familiar concept, but I thought we should go over a little bit because it's actually an interesting part of reactor design. And we'd actually come up in some of the previous discussions. So, how about, can someone tell me, what is the basic idea of passive safety in a reactor versus active safety? Does anybody have a succinct answer to that? Really?
Passive means that if you don't do anything at all, it'll end up in a safe configuration, and active requires action.
Yeah.
Part of the operators.
Right. So, thank you. So, passive, you default to maybe a subcritical configuration. So, what are the key elements then? I mean, again, I'm certainly not an expert in reactor design, but I recall from my engineering design courses, right, there's some key features that would play into passive safety, right? The idea of reactivity coefficients. Give me an example of, say, one of the key reactivity coefficients that would play in whether your reactor is going to be passively safe or require active safety. You follow where I'm going with that?
Kind of. I mean, so there's like one example would be do the control rods automatically fall in and reduce them out, but I'm not sure.
Well, I guess that's a good one. I wasn't thinking that, but you could have the control rods have to be actively suspended, and loss of power would leave them dropping on automatically. I was thinking in terms of the reactivity coefficients.
Oh.
Right? And just quickly, three pop to mind. So in an accident or in a reactor situation where you may have temperatures start to increase, you naturally want to have reactivity. Well, let me go back. The reactivity, the criticality of the reactor is going to be affected by the temperature of the materials. And what happens if, as the temperature increases, the reactivity increases? And the small increment of increased temperature leads to an increase in K, increased reactivity, which is going to generate more power, will lead to more higher temperature, more activity. You're going to have an unstable situation. So I don't recall the right terminology. I think it was an alpha, something like an alpha T, a temperature reactivity coefficient. You like it, so in the fuel, as the fuel temperature increases, you want the reactivity of the fuel to decrease naturally on its own, without having to do anything. What would be one of the physical phenomena that would give you negative reactivity in your fuel? And what happens if things get hot, they might expand, right? Your fuel might in a fuel pin, and that would be a marginally lower density, and you would have slightly lower reactivity. But that's the basic idea. It can be as simple as things heat up, you want them to expand in a way so that the reactivity goes down, so that you don't have runaway temperature increases. Does that make sense? I think there's reactivity coefficients for the moderators. So it can be the fuel temperature, it can be the moderator. Same idea. As you heat up the moderator, you can do things like reduce its density, whether it's molten salt or I don't know the reactivity coefficient of molten salts, but it's water, pressurized water, or boiling water. You can change its neutron scattering cross section and thus its moderating properties. Ideally, maybe you want the reactivity to go down as the temperature goes up again. You can affect the neutronics, and that's, I think, a little bit more subtle, and we won't get into that, but you can have broadening of cross sections, right, with different temperatures. As a neutron that's thermalized, I mean, it's thermalized, but it's in a very hot reactor, but it's bouncing around at the thermal temperature of the reactor. It can bounce out. Now, if the moderator's very hot, the temperature that it bounces back at is slightly different, right, because the thermal vibration temperature in the moderator is different, so that will affect reactivity. You have void fraction reactivity, and that gets to what type of accident, like a loss of coolant accident. We want to have negative reactivity or loss of coolant, meaning as you lose moderator altogether, you hope that your reaction will want to shut itself down. I think that's, in my mind, that's one of your inherent benefits of having your coolant and your moderator do the same thing. Loss of coolant then also becomes loss of moderator. You tend to have a strong negative reactivity coefficient. What type of reactor doesn't have the same moderator and coolant? We talked about some basic reactor types last week. That's an example of a reactor in which the moderator and the coolant are totally different materials. In this case, even different phases of the material. What's that? No, boiling would be the same. Right? The water that's doing the cooling. I mean, it's not black and white. There can be reflector materials and stuff that aren't the same as the coolant, but in general, the water is actually exposed to coolant and moderator. I was thinking of like the high temperature gas reactors. We have the high temperature gas as the coolant, but you can have graphite as the moderating material or other materials. A solid graphite moderator is not going to go away. If you lose your coolant, the reactor temperature is going to go up. I don't know. I hope the temperature coefficient for graphite is negative. Otherwise, you would have a problem if you have a loss of coolant in a reactor like that. So that gets the idea. Things that are naturally built into the design of the reactor, so that you don't have to do anything. And if there's a problem, the temperature starts to increase or the reactivity starts to increase too much, it has phenomena that will tend to shut it down. Versus things where people need to get involved and actuate control rods. I'm sorry, I forget your name, but you made the point about the control rods, and if they had to be activated and physically, mechanically, electromechanically lifted up into a reactor core, and you had a loss of electrical power for some reason, and you couldn't get it, that would be a big problem with an active safety system. That's the idea. You want the reactor to take care of itself. So, I don't know, were there any other points that came up in the talk that weren't clear to everybody?
You mentioned the 81,000 watt and something it's a product made by.
Actually, I think it's a reactor design. It's a new whole design of a major commercial power reactor.
That makes has some special.
Anybody? I actually don't know. Yeah.
The 1000 is a generation 3 phase reactor with passive safety incorporated. With passive safety. You know why reactors have to have passive safety in the past? Many things do.
Well, I think it's a matter of degree. And I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a pretty straightforward concept. I don't know. It's a good question. Any other questions? I just want to say a couple words before Professor Knapp takes over and gets into the non-proliferation discussion about the midterm next week. So certainly from the technical side, it'll cover everything we've discussed so far, inclusive. There'll be 5 questions on policy, there'll be 5 questions on technical. You can choose a subset of those. Please go over your notes. You'll sample it from all the weeks that we've been discussing some of these topics. There's certain terms I'll put in there that may be a little jargony, but I want you to be able to understand and be facile with, be able to use it as part of the discussion. I said last week we'd be getting into a discussion of radiation detection, interaction of radiation with matter. So the schedule flipped a little bit. We're not going to get to that today, and so that won't be part of the midterm. We'll say that. We'll get to that maybe the evening of the midterm. After the midterm, we might start discussing it, but it won't be. Any other questions about the midterm? Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Is there a Austrian film which I used in
Oh, well, I'm sure there are. I've seen them. In general, a good textbook's going to have, even Lamarche. Right, I can look back my version of Lamarche. Online, there's many good resources. I bet if you Google nuclear technology, nuclear reactor terminology, you probably find a lot of good websites. A lot of them are really educationally focused.
I think the NRC is a good source for that. And I'll try to send one.
Great, okay. Yes, both the policy and the technical sections will be 5 questions and you choose 3. And they'll be relatively broad questions, but they will ask you to draw on all the readings and all the discussions and class presentations, nothing other than what we've asked you to read and or we've discussed. Okay? And now we'll take up until about 7 o'clock, and then we'll have another substantive presentation from 7 to 8 after your break on next week, which is the 14th. Okay? If you have any particular questions, you can always email us. Okay, so I'd like to spend a little time tonight in the time we have left, am I being picked up with it? About arms control and non-proliferation. But before I do that, I've always said, people ask me from elsewhere, what is it like to teach at Berkeley? And I say it's wonderful because there aren't actually students who ask that many questions, but there are many who offer corrections. So I have a wonderful correction that I received today, but not from the students, from one of the nation's greatest experts in this field, Bruce Goodwin, who is former director of the weapons program at Lawrence Livermore and currently associate director at large at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And he's been following sessions by through web streaming. And he said the following, I'm not going to read all of it, but to paraphrase. In part 2 of lecture 3, that's me, said that Sandia was established to do non-nuclear work in systems integration for weapons. While this is true today, the systems integration role at Sandia is of recent vintage. Until some changes were made about 15 years ago, the weapon systems integration role was done at either Los Alamos or Livermore, depending upon which lab had the lead for a weapon system. In that sense, Sandia worked for each of the nuclear labs in the nuclear lab systems role. This old system avoided a self-interested monopoly of systems integration and the possibility of decisions by the organization that determine need, design, and produces the non-nuclear majority of the weapon. But when the change was made, it wasn't expected to be a huge cost increase in some of the weapons changes, such as these LEPs that we discussed this briefly. These are the life extension programs, such as the B-61, which we may not have gotten into much yet. It's a bomb for the European-based aircraft. But there's been a big cost explosion, and we only have one systems integrator, so the government is not able to go to others to get a competitive process going. So that's one correction. The second is with respect to peak nuclear weapons numbers. I think I mentioned in class that both the U.S. and the Soviets were in the 30,000s at the peak of the Cold War. And Bruce has some specific numbers from the NRDC. The NRDC is the Natural Resource Defense Council. And the NRDC says that the U.S. peaked in 1966 at 31,700. The Soviets peaked in 1984 at 40,723. Now, whether their numbers are totally accurate, I don't know, but anyway, it gives you some real numbers. So 65, 70,000 nuclear weapons. That's a lot of weapons. Thank you, Bruce, for the corrections. And more welcome. Okay, now, we got into some of this last time, but I wanted to flesh out a few key points and provide a bit more of the acronym of this business. There had actually been some efforts at arms control going back to the 50s. There were efforts to try to warm up slightly the Cold War. There was an international geophysical year in 1957, and it was hoped that there could be some agreements of some kind that could improve the very tense relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And this first part I'm going to talk about is just U.S.-Soviet. And this did lead to an outer space treaty in 1957 and to an Antarctic treaty, both of which precluded the deployment of or use of nuclear weapons in those areas, in outer space or the Antarctic. And the reason that these agreements were able to be reached is because at that time, neither side, I think, had any plans to deploy nuclear weapons in outer space or the Antarctic. So it was kind of a freebie. But again, the point is that you can make sort of some symbolic progress and possibly warm up things a little bit by agreeing to things that neither side planned to do anyway. Now, a serious discussion on strategic arms limitations began, as I mentioned, when Johnson was planning to initiate a bilateral negotiation with the Soviet Union, but was precluded because of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Nixon came in 69, and Kissinger was his national security advisor. Kissinger was a strategist, was a student of diplomacy, had been at that Harvard MIT Arms Control Seminar in 1960, and basically was an advocate to launch what became the SALT talks. It's really WCT, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which began in October 69. So basically they were deferred a year because of the Soviet invasion. The Soviets didn't do anything to change the conditions. They still occupied Czechoslovakia and ran it. And it took from October 69 till 72 to reach agreement, 3 years. And there were two agreements, the SALT I talks. One was an agreement to limit missile defenses. Remember I told you that McNamara had lectured to Reagan on the destabilizing aspects of missile defenses. The missile defenses were limited to 2 sites in each country, one to protect the national capital and one 1,500 or more kilometers away from the national capital, which meant it could protect some missile fields somewhere. But basically what it meant was, if both sides adhered to that agreement, the balance of the territory was completely vulnerable to a missile attack. And ironically, perversely, that would mean a stable situation. Neither side had an incentive to strike first, because both sides were basically vulnerable to attack. Is that point clear? The other part of the SALT agreement was an interim agreement, a 5-year agreement to limit offensive force deployments to whatever the levels were at that time. And at that time, according to known sources, the Soviets had a slight numerical advantage over the United States. And this caused a big stir in the Senate. Remember, it's the Senate and the Senate alone that ratifies treaties. It's the Foreign Relations Committee that holds the hearings, but because it's arms control, the Armed Services Committee is also directly involved. And then after the treaty is voted out of committee, with approval, it goes to the floor of the Senate, and the full 100 senators get a chance to vote, and 67 have to support ratification. Or if not everyone is present because they're out campaigning for president or doing other things, 2/3 of these He said 2/3 of senators present and voting must support ratification. If they do, then say that the treaty has been ratified by the Senate, and then copies of the treaty are physically deposited wherever the treaty says to deposit them. The Seoul treaties were deposited in Washington and Moscow, the two national capitals, and I think also Geneva. And once they were deposited by both parties, the treaty entered into force, EIF. And that's the beginning of the operational meaning of the treaty. Without EIF, treaties, even though signed by the president or some other dignitary, don't have any force of law. Once EIF is completed by all parties, or both parties in this case, then it's binding. There was a huge fight in the Senate about this treaty, particularly on the interim agreement. Senator Scoop Jackson, who later was a presidential candidate, a Democrat from Washington State, wanted an amendment that stipulated that never again would the U.S. ever sign an arms control treaty with the Soviet Union where we were numerically inferior to them, no matter what the subject. And that was approved. I'd say also at this time, they developed a strong rejoinder to the Harvard-MIT view about arms control. The Harvard-MIT view of arms control was anything that can reduce the likelihood of war, reduce the damage should war occur, or reduce funds preparing for war is arms control. It's a very broad definition. This is in the Schelling-Halpern book, Strategy and Arms Control. Washington, one of the key people was a staff member working for Scoop Jackson named Richard Pearl, P-E-R-L-E, who became very prominent in the Reagan years. Pearl had a completely antithetical view to this. He said arms control is either irrelevant, dangerous, or treasonous. The point being that he said, you're dealing with a totalitarian regime that controls all aspects of human life in their country, with no vestiges of democracy in any way, no judiciary system, no independent parliament, no elections, no press, no freedom of speech, nothing. And you're expecting them to abide by the treaty. They will find ways to cheat, while the U.S., because of political pressures, will of course be fully in support of implementation of the treaty and will abide scrupulously by the terms of the treaty, so that overall it'll be highly disadvantageous to the United States and highly advantageous to the Soviet Union. He basically said, and Pearl was just a member of a group that supported this view. He said basically, with friends, you don't need arms control because there's nothing to control. And with adversaries, you can't have arms control because they're trying to destroy you. So they were virulently, people of this group, opposed to the treaty. One member who had been in the Seoul delegation and then started out in the Seoul II delegation but resigned and endorsed the Pearl view was Paul Nitze. He was a very famous defense analyst. And on CTBT, there are several major books about him. And he later became an arms control. When he was not in government, he was a critic of arms control. And when he was in government, he was an arms control negotiator. Later on, he was an arms control negotiator in the Reagan administration. And he was one of the many Democrats who shifted from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party in the Carter-Reagan years. Now, I think I ended the session last time by making a kind of odd statement, quoting Kissinger, who said at one point, remember, arms control has nothing to do with arms control. So now let me explain what that means, and there is a brief discussion of this. It's in two places. One is he had an aide, one of his closest advisors was also a German refugee who was a Soviet specialist, named Al Sonnenfeld. He passed away a few years ago. We're now getting into the last 40 years, so I actually know these people. And I can tell you stories about each one of them, but I'll spare most of the story. Sonnenfeld wrote an article in 1975 in the Naval War College Review, a relatively obscure place. Oh, it's a very good journal. With something, something like the meaning of détente. Détente was a posture, a French word which means, relaxation of tensions, that Kissinger ultimately persuaded Nixon, and then when Nixon was forced out because of Watergate, Ford to adopt, although Ford later rejected it. And so for a long time, Kissinger was arguing that SALT and arms control of the Soviet Union was part of détente. Sonnenfeld has a more explicit explanation of what that means. And let me give you the kind of short version in plain language. Kissinger felt that the diagnosis about the Soviet Union was absolutely right, that they were mostly thugs. This is in the pre-Gorbachev era. Because, by the way, not a single Soviet leader after Lenin and before Gorbachev had gone to college. Many of them had almost no schooling. They had, in many cases, murdered many people, each of them individually. This is a tough game to rise to the top. If you don't rise to the top, you're floating down the Volga River somewhere. They had none of the vestiges of democracy, no plans to get into that business, and they were a threat. Kissinger said, okay, we agree on the diagnosis. So the question is, what do you do about it? Kissinger felt that the decision-making in Moscow was basically the group of 9 men, members of the Politburo. All key decisions were made by those 9 men. And they were hermetically sealed from any kind of political pressures, interest groups, that we understand, in a democracy. He went on to say, supposing we could have some arms control agreements, and then maybe some other agreements that could lessen tensions, right? Just reduce tensions. Because after all, the Soviets presented the threat from the United States as the reason why they had to have such strict control over their people. If the perceived threat of the United States in the Soviet Union was reduced, and ultimately arms control might be followed up by some economic relationship, because there was no economic relationship. Russia was an autarky, which means an isolated economic entity, completely self-contained with its communist allies, North Korea, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria. These were pretty meager economies. Cuba. If ultimately tensions were reduced and arms control was followed by economic intercourse, then slowly but surely, Russians, like all human beings, would see things that they'd want to buy because they didn't have any access to these things. They begin to be introduced to what we call the consumer economy. And this might take decades, he said. This is not going to happen overnight. But with this process would develop possibly some vestiges of individual wealth. Hard to tell whether they would allow that. They didn't allow it initially. And with that would come differing perspectives on how to proceed with the United States and diversification of views about Soviet policy, which would lead to different pressures coming on the Politburo to proceed in different ways, because people would now have a stake in keeping the flow of goods and having visitors from places like Berkeley coming and all that. They wouldn't want to have that cut off after getting used to having them. Am I being sort of clear? It's a very long-term, incremental, fits and starts, nonlinear process. But the net effect over the long term would box in the Politburo, and whoever the new Politburo would be in 20 years, from being nearly as aggressive because they had too much to lose from what was developing in the relations with the United States. And not only the United States, but Western Europe, and maybe Japan, and all the rest. So Kissinger, I can't vouch for knowing what was in his mind, but having had some interaction with him and have read all of his writings and know many people who knew him better than I do, I think believed that as we built up to these huge numbers of nuclear weapons, the likelihood that they would be used was really trivial. He just didn't believe, assuming that the Russian leadership, Soviet leadership was rational, which of course is itself contentious, but assuming that they were rational, didn't want to have their own country destroyed, there was no way they were going to start a nuclear war with the United States, knowing that they'd be destroyed. So the details of the numbers of the agreements were actually not very important. You had to manage the political discourse in the United States. That was a big deal. But it didn't matter if they had 27% more than we did. Now, this was very controversial. And initially, what happened was, as Pearl and some of the critics predicted, there was strong sentiment from what became like the political left in the U.S. to say, well, we don't need all these weapons. We can just unilaterally get rid of a lot of them. So Pearl said, you see, it isn't the Soviet Union that's going to kind of relax its guard. It's the U.S. that's going to relax its guard. And we're going to be in a more dangerous situation where they can exploit their advantages at our expense. I have to tell you that this argument is going on tonight with respect to the Iran agreement, subject of your course project. The same way, although Obama hasn't quite articulated this, and you see this in the analysis if you follow it, the results of the Iranian election, which was just held, where so-called moderates won key support, although not true regime critics, but intermediate folks, that having agreements that push people away from the precipice of war lead to entrepreneurial activities and greater diversification of views, all the kinds of things Kissinger was hoping for would happen with the Soviet Union. Others are now hoping will happen with Iran, which may or may not. Anyway, Ford was convinced by his new Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld, the youngest Secretary of Defense in U.S. history, who then under George W. Bush became the oldest Secretary of Defense in U.S. history, that this was a bad idea for no other reason. Politically, it was bad, in that the Republican Party would never buy it, and then probably the American people wouldn't buy it. And Ford, in 1976, remember, Ford is the only individual who was neither elected vice president nor elected president. Remember that? Ford was running for election for the first time in 76, but he was challenged in the Republican primary by Ronald Reagan, governor of California, who was way to his right and basically bought into the fact that arms control was stupid or dangerous or both. And Rumsfeld told Ford that he could not embrace détente and hope to be nominated. He'd lose the nomination to Reagan. And Reagan was much more charismatic and he was just photogenic, a former actor, and very good looking, and he had all the cachet. And Ford was very kind of, he's from the Midwest, he was more, not as exciting. Anyway, Ford agreed with Rumsfeld and dropped détente and beat back the Reagan challenge and won the nomination, but then chose not to pursue SALT II, which Kissinger had urged him to do. And Ford was defeated. Ford was defeated in the 76 election by this peanut farmer that few people had heard of, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter pushed hard on arms control. He was a supporter of arms control along the lines of the Harvard MIT group, although his national security advisor is Zbigniew Brzezinski, a Columbia University professor from Poland who was virulently anti-Russian, was not a big fan of it, but Carter was, and Cyrus Vance, the Secretary of State, was. My doctoral dissertation advisor was an advisor to Secretary Vance, so I know all of these folks. But Carter was rebuffed by the Soviets in an initial discussion of SALT II. They ultimately reached an agreement, and then after the agreement, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And Carter was absolutely awestruck. And Carter himself, Carter was a Naval Academy graduate. He was a nuclear submariner. This was not some, flaky guy from Shattuck Avenue. He was the real deal, but he was actually quite liberal on foreign policy issues. And the SALT II treaty had been signed, was submitted to the Senate, and Carter withdrew the submission, saying, I cannot ask you to consider ratification of SALT II if the Soviet Union has just invaded Afghanistan. Carter also made a very seemingly foolish statement. He said, I've learned more about the Soviet Union in the last 2 weeks than I knew about them in the last 40 years, which made him seem very naive. Ronald Reagan, who had lost in 76, again challenged this time Carter, and Carter had other problems. The economy was in free fall. There was 20% inflation in the United States. There had been oil embargoes, and also the Iran Revolution had taken place, and the U.S. diplomats had been taken hostage in the embassy in November of 1979. The election was a year later. Carter was urged to do something to restore his image. By the way, Carter had also, he made a very, maybe it was technically correct, but it was politically not very smart statement. In the summer of 1979, he went on national television, Carter, and said the country is in a malaise, M-A-L-A-I-S-E. It's kind of in a funk. And we're not very happy about things, and we're not very optimistic about our future. And he fired half his cabinet, including James Schlesinger, who was Secretary of Energy. I actually was traveling. I was literally in Czechoslovakia, in Eastern Europe, invited to give a talk when I heard about this. I just couldn't believe that Carter would say this. And Reagan was an optimist, and he spoke, there'll be mourning in America if I'm elected. He didn't quite say this, but he could have used a phrase like, we're going to make America great again. And it really took off. And so Carter's advisors felt by the early fall of 1980 that unless he made an effort to rescue the hostages, he would not be reelected. So he did. There was a clandestine effort to rescue the hostages who were in the city of Tehran. Not an easy place to rescue people. And the helicopters landed in the desert, and there was an unexpected windstorm. A couple of the helicopters crashed. The entire mission was aborted. And then Carter went on TV to apologize for this. And he was, that in the election a few weeks later, he was crushed. Reagan won by a gigantic Joe, Carter was out, one-term president. So you have to, what I'm saying here is, to actually understand arms control agreements, you have to understand the entire sort of strategic and political context around which they're being framed. It's not just to look at the numbers, look at the details. You have to look at the details. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Later on, Reagan, after being very tough on the Soviet Union, calling it the evil empire, going to Berlin and telling Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall, being very confrontational with the Soviet Union. In his second term, turned to ways to try to improve relations. It's alleged in part because of the advice of Nancy Reagan, who just passed away yesterday. That's what's something I call the pillow talk theory of foreign policy decision making. It's more important what the wife and husband say to each other in the bedroom sometimes than visit all these interagency meetings. And also, Reagan was taken with Gorbachev, very smart, honors graduate in law at Moscow State University. His wife is a PhD in philosophy. And these are the kind of Russians we could talk to. And ironically, Gorbachev was really an odd mixture. He was a devout communist in that he believed in the truth and superiority of the communist political system. But he was not authoritarian in the sense that he didn't believe it was appropriate to prop up communism with the use of force or the threat of the use of force. That if it's good, if it's a great system, people don't have to be terrified to stay in it. They'll want to stay in it. Well, it turned out people didn't want to stay in it. And a very key moment was when there were demonstrations that started out in East Germany, led by some Protestant, very, very courageous Protestant ministers. Because, you start making statements against the regime, that could be the end. But Gorbachev refused to allow the East German regime, led by this man Honecker, who was a virulent anti-Western communist, to use force. And that led to demonstrations in East Berlin at the wall, demanding that the wall be opened so that people could leave East Berlin and go to West Berlin. If it's such a great thing, we can go when we want, we'll come back, not a problem. Then comes to one of these strange moments in history. You think this all has to happen? It's all cosmic forces that are going to make things happen. The good guy's always good and the bad guy's always lose. Here's what's alleged to have happened. The border guards right in East Berlin see all these people demonstrating. They want to get out. There'd already been some East Germans that had gone under or around the wall. Many of them had been killed. And also East Germans were leaving. They were getting out through Hungary into Austria. They were getting out that way. But the East German border guards did not have orders how to deal with these large numbers of demonstrators. This is in 1989, November. So the head of the East German border guard team there radioed back, this is, pre-email days, radioed back to the center of East Berlin, Communist Party headquarters. What do we do? These people are all standing, screaming, yelling to get out. Now, here is the odd moment. It's alleged, and there's some documentation of this, that the response from the East German Communist Party was, tell them we will let them out. But it was like, you'll be a Nobel Prize winner someday. And the East German border guard, in all the noise, heard him say, let them out. So they opened the barricades. And the people just ran out. And then they started to chop down the wall from both sides. And in short order, every one of the Soviet allied states, Poland, which had its own history, it was like the lesson solidarity, Czechoslovakia, which had split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Hungary, East Germany, Bulgaria, Romania, which was vibrant through their governors. And Gorbachev was on the ropes. He didn't expect this to happen. He didn't think that he thought that people supported communism. He was a really smart guy. Some Russians said, you see what happens when you get an intellectual in the government? They didn't know what the hell's going on. August, it was a quiet time. I woke up one morning and our cousin said to me, Michael, you follow this stuff. Did you hear? There's been a coup d'etat in Moscow. I said, what? Gorbachev's been overthrown. And this could mean almost anything, but it's probably not going to be good. And it turned out a group of senior military and intelligence and party officials that Gorbachev was heading the Soviet Union toward ruin, and they were going to depose him. They held him under house arrest. Reza Gorbachev, his wife, who was very prominent in international circles, PhD, very smart, lovely, and all that. She probably had a stroke out of terror that they were going to execute them. Gorbachev hung tough. The leadership of the coup, some very interesting people, but I don't have time to get into all that. The leadership of the coup went to other parts of Moscow to gain greater support, and they didn't have the support. And this great Russian nationalist, who was a communist, member of the Communist Party, one of the key figures in the Russian government within the Soviet government, Boris Yeltsin, said, you can't do that anymore. You can't do that anymore. You want to make a change, you just kill a guy. Do it. Those days are over. And who knows what? I mean, I was critical right at that moment. Yeltsin actually stood on top of a tank. So you'll have to kill me. And they backed down. So the coup makers against Gorbachev backed down, and Gorbachev returned to power all in the space of a couple of weeks in the summer of 1991. And then Yeltsin said, I saved you, but I have a price. And the price is I want Russia as an independent state. I want this to be the end of the Soviet Union. 15 republics. They'll each be an independent country. Gorbachev again, he could have used force, he could have killed Yeltsin, he could have done a lot of things. He didn't. And December 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and went out of business without a shot being fired. And in some sense, you could say vindicated to some degree the Kissinger view. So it started with SALT. It didn't take 70 years or 700 years. It took less than 20 years. And the whole thing collapsed. Now, there's a different view. There's a Reagan laudatory view that Reagan was tough. He pushed Star Wars, Strategic Defense Initiative, stimulating Russian defense spending. They were in the economic room trying to compete with the U.S., and that was the reason they collapsed. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. What are the root causes of the Soviet collapse of 1991? There was a great book by Jack Matlock, who was U.S. ambassador to Moscow, about it, but I don't think there's really a definitive account yet. Oh, by the way, another treaty which came along was the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. This is relevant to this day because since Putin came back and now invaded Ukraine, the U.S. has openly alleged that the Soviets are violating the INF Treaty. And relations now, of course, you fast forward from 1992 to 2016, relations today are as bad as they have been U.S.-Russian relations since probably the early 80s, the Reagan first term, at the height of the Cold War. They're really bad, and there's a lot going on. None of it's good. So that's a longer version than I expected on strategic arms control and the U.S. relationship. I have 725 in the real world. That's his report date. Is it 725? Okay. So questions, comments, thoughts about any of that? Before the Soviet Union collapsed, after George H.W. Bush became president, he was able to include the START Treaty and then the START II Treaty. These are all to reduce the number of deployed strategic nuclear weapons. And they both entered into force, but later on, so this one entered into force, this one did not, was part of the Coup. This one entered into force, this one entered into force, but then in 2002, George W. Bush withdrew from the INF Treaty. Now, this is not a violation. Pro-arms control people say this is a violation of the treaty. It's not. Every treaty in international law has a clause, or more than a clause, that stipulates how you can get out of the treaty. And there's always the following condition. If conditions emerge that threaten the national security of the state, I guess it's subjective, how do you know? Then that could be the basis to withdraw from the treaty. So George W. Bush merely exercised the U.S.'s legal right and said, conditions have changed, the North Koreans and the Iranians are missile threats, and we want regional missile defenses to protect against them. We can't have an ABM treaty that just defends Moscow. So he withdrew from the treaty, which was part of helped stimulate, not that it needed a lot of stimulation, but helped stimulate the Putin animosity toward the United States. There had already been under Clinton major expansion of NATO right after the Russian border, which was deeply troubling to the Russians. Because all those countries that had been Soviet allies in the so-called Warsaw Pact all became NATO members. Right? Poland is a NATO member. Hungary is a NATO member. Germany became united as a NATO member. The Czech Republic is a NATO member. It's even some of the countries of the former Yugoslavia are NATO members. Albania, which is really outside the Beltway, is a NATO member. Bulgaria is a NATO member. So ultimately, we've gone through a roller coaster ride with the Soviet Union, and at the moment we're in a deep, cold situation with that. We'll talk about that maybe later. Now, while all this is going on, the question is, how can you stop the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries? On that, the U.S. and the Soviet Union agreed, more or less. It's the haves and the have-nots. The haves say nuclear weapons are bad. We'll have them. You shouldn't have them. Then everything will be great. So, of course, is it duplicitous? Is it inconsistent? Although, absolutely. But you know what? This is life. It's true in all aspects. It's true with your girlfriend. It's true with your mother. Life is not linear, and everybody's in love with everybody else. At least that's the world I've been to. Maybe I'm in the wrong world. So the basic theme for the United States since the beginning of the nuclear age has been fewer hands on the nuclear trigger reduce the likelihood of nuclear use. More hands, greater likelihood of use. Once nuclear weapons are used again, as Shelley said, the tradition of non-use is broken. All bets are off. We don't know what's going to happen, but probably there'll be a lot of nuclear weapons used. It's not going to be good. Not going to be good. So the U.S. and the Soviets, even during the Cold War, and even since, have tried to develop incentives, architectures, agreements, lots of things to keep the spread of nuclear weapons low. Now, there's a literature on this, which is pretty substantial. There's discussion in the Bracken book, which by this time is on your, in your syllabus, Paul Bracken's book, on the second nuclear age. I'll get to Bracken's point in just a minute, but let me go back on non-proliferation. I'd say one of the first efforts to say nuclear weapons are not that important, cool it, don't think about it, speaking to the other countries of the world, was this treaty I mentioned last time, the Limited Test Ban Treaty. This was a Kennedy-JFK treaty, June '63, limiting testing to only underground. Underground testing, though, after the Joint Chiefs had guaranteed that they could improve nuclear weapons with the labs with underground testing. So in other words, the chiefs wanted to continue to improve the weapons. Kennedy wanted an agreement to reduce tensions. Underground treaty checks both boxes. Later on, when Kissinger was hanging in there after Nixon resigned, Ford is in power, and before Ford fell off the bandwagon on détente, they completed the threshold test ban treaty, CTBT. This is 63, this is 74. Threshold test ban treaty limits the testing underground to 150 kilotons. 150 kilotons is a lot. 150 kilotons is 7 times the Hiroshima bomb. Not exactly a pipsqueak weapon. And then continued negotiations about a comprehensive test ban. Cut out all testing, make all testing illegal. This treaty gets signed, maybe in '96. Clinton wants this ratified. He assigns a senior senator from the Foreign Relations Committee, Joe Biden, to lead the congressional effort to get it ratified. They have a vote in 1998 to ratify the CTBT. It goes to the floor of the Senate, and the treaty is overwhelmingly rejected. It's actually, you need 2/3 vote in favor, and I think they had a majority against. It wasn't even close. And this was a mix of different motives, even though these still were reasonably decent times in U.S.-Russian relations. People were concerned. There was a technical concern that the Russians were engaging in possibly very low yield testing. And if we signed a comprehensive, we would stop all testing. They would not. They would have very low yield testing, and we would not be able to verify that they were in compliance or likely not in compliance. So the CTBT went down. Of course, it was never considered under George W. Bush for 8 years, but under Obama, they tried several times to brush it up and move it forward, but they've chosen not to ever bring it back to the Senate. Now, of course, with a Republican majority, you could lose 2-1, more than 2-1. It's hopeless. Yes.
What stops if Obama wants to push it through? I'm like, if there's the political will and things. All that aside, would it be possible to consider approving it from the American side as an executive agreement instead of a treaty?
No, because it is, it's already been codified as a comprehensive test ban treaty.
Yeah, okay.
And therefore he can't just wave a wand and say, I'll call it an executive agreement. He's done a lot with executive agreements in this last year or two to get around the Senate, Republican-controlled Senate, but he can't do that. So he's stuck, and I think it's highly unlikely. He's a choice to bring it to the Senate and have it overwhelmingly rejected, or to not bother. Even when I was there in 2009, 2010, there was a lot of discussion about it. I said, whistling in the graveyard. Yes.
So, given that we already have these sort of phenomenal nuclear arsenals, why is there so much opposition? What's the root cause?
Because there are still those You know, there's an excellent article written by a former colleague of mine. He's now in his 90s. Most of my colleagues are not kids anymore. Richard Pipes. Richard Pipes was one of the most prominent Russian historians at Harvard, Pipes. In the 70s, when Carter was president, he wrote an article called "Why the Soviets Think They Can Fight and Win a Nuclear War." And the thesis of Pipes' article is they've never given up on victory. They don't want only victory, they want to destroy the United States. They want to kill everybody here, everybody. And they're just waiting for the right time. Just the time hasn't been right. They haven't had enough stuff. They haven't had enough, you know, to take our initial first strike and defend against a retaliatory strike. There are many important people here in Washington who believe nothing has changed. And if anything, things are worse now under Coup. So the numbers don't matter. What matters is the exchange calculations to see whether they can take out our forces in the first strike and at least defend against a residual strike. So that gets into all kinds of things you have to look at. You know, we have submarines in a vast ocean open areas with ballistic missiles. How are they going to target those submarines? Do they have some secret way to make the submarines vulnerable, space-based observations, other things, so sonar. And for others, it's not about such a cataclysmic scenario. It's that you let the Soviets, you know, you don't have agreements, and the Soviets have more than we do, and they take advantage. They use it for coercive diplomacy. They go to Europe and say, you know, give us all your croissants, or we'll blow your head off. They're not going to do it. All they have to do is go there, and the French will say, I give up, I give up. You know, this is also a view that, you know, the Europeans are totally worthless. They're weak. All they want to do is have meetings, to schedule more meetings. You know, they want, you know, eight months vacation. And, you know, how do they enjoy this fabulous life? Because they're free riders on U.S. security. We're the guys there who'll fight and die for them. They won't. It's a very, you know, angry view of a lot of the world. But I can tell you, if you're watching any of the political debates, these views are alive and well, and in fact, stronger than ever before. That's a sort of short answer to the question. Now, the cornerstone of non-proliferation has been the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which we discussed a little bit last time. This was signed in '68, entered into force in 1970, and it's basically a two-part deal. The nuclear weapon states, which are cited as 5 and 5 only, U.S., Soviet Union, now Russia, China, Britain, and France, agree not to help any other country acquire nuclear weapons. And the non-nuclear weapon states, everybody else that's a party, agrees not to try to get nuclear weapons, but in return gets a lot of assistance to develop their nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, the Pear-Peterson track. Get the reactors, get electric power generation. That has worked pretty well. Every 5 years is an NPT review conference. I attended one as a government official, and there you hear a lot from countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America that the U.S. isn't doing enough to move toward complete nuclear disarmament. Because it might be complete nuclear disarmament is let's say it's a long path, measured in multiple infinities. But that's just my view. Others have a different view. There's also been set up the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which controls the flow of fissionable material to other countries. And don't forget that the U.S., this is sometimes overlooked, The U.S. has signed a number of mutual security pacts. NATO is a mutual defense pact, which says if any country is invaded, we are all invaded. That's why you have concerns now. Will the Russians do something in the Baltics that they did in Ukraine? Baltics are now NATO members. Baltics also used to be part of the Soviet Union. They're now NATO members. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are NATO members. The time to get from Tallinn in Estonia to St. Petersburg is a few hours. They're right there. Russian tanks are coming to Tallinn before tomorrow's class and have it. And that would be an attack on NATO. Therefore, the U.S. and the Soviet Union would be at war. This is not good news. So the U.S. has a mutual defense treaty through NATO, mutual defense treaty with Japan, mutual defense treaty with South Korea. And this is all not only to defend them, not only to deter the Russians, but it's also non-proliferation. It's to dissuade these allies from themselves acquiring nuclear weapons. Say, you don't need to go down the nuclear route. We're here to protect you. And the question is, how long will this extended deterrence last? How long will it be credible? Currently, there are some Korean parliamentarians calling for Korean nuclear weapons. And the Korean government keeps disavowing it, say they don't speak for us, we're not going to have it, this and that. When we hear from Brad Roberts on April 4th, a lot of his new book, The Case for Nuclear Weapons in the 21st Century, is about alliance reassurance and extended deterrence as a central reason to have a robust nuclear force. Because it means then that our security guarantees are credible with the allies. And we'll talk more about that. So that's down at the bottom. Regional security, NATO, Japan, South Korea. I know you can't read any of this. Yes.
Does Russia have mutual defense treaties?
I don't think so anymore. They have something. They've signed some mutual pact with China not too long ago, and they've had them with some of the stands, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, but I don't think any of them stipulate this kind of if you're attacked, I'm attacked. All these countries are concerned they're going to be attacked by Russia.
That's like an equal disadvantage, right? It's liability.
It's an asymmetry, yeah.
It's
That's right.
massive asymmetry.
That's right. And some people look at the exact world and see something totally different. They see a very weak Russia. We can get into this too. A country that's economy's in big trouble, that has no essential allies at all. Look at the plethora of allies the U.S. has. Look at the strength of the U.S. economy. In the world economy. And what do? They, like was said years ago. I think I may have mentioned this. People say there's no international market for refrigerators that keep beer warm. It's what the Russians manufacture. Or they have raincoats, but they're not water repellent. This is not a winner. You just can't do it. The Russians make a few things. They supply oil and gas. They supply nuclear technology. They supply conventional weapons. Full stop. That's it. Do you see a lot of Russian ships in Target? No, you see Chinese ships in Target. So, and even the regime has vestiges of democracy, but it's very limited, Putin basically runs the show. So it's the same side, looking at the same thing. Some see a very dangerous, threatening Russia, and some see a very weak Russia. Now, while all that's going on, there have been a couple of real problem cases. One that the U.S. has basically looked the other way on is Israel. Israel's had a problem since its existence in 1948. It was attacked the day it declared its independence. It's had multiple wars with its Arab neighbors. It's had now a protracted war with the Palestinians. It's gone on for 40 years. So going way back to the 50s, the founding Prime Minister of Israel, Ben Gurion, it's now known through documentation, assigned to a young aide of his named Shimon Peres, who's now 90 years old and formerly Prime Minister of Israel himself, to develop the Israeli nuclear weapons program. Israel has never admitted this. They've never formally tested. You cannot get any Israeli official, public, private, or anywhere else to say they have the weapons. The weapons are, if they exist, they're highly secretly stored. But the consensus by people who study this all the time is they have 150 to 200 weapons. Yes.
Well, didn't they work in tandem with the French program very heavily?
They didn't work in tandem with the French program. The French helped them build the Dimona reactor and gave them technical advice in the early stages of the program. But then the French turned on Israel later on after the '67 war, and with de Gaulle in power, and not interested in supporting Israel militarily at all. It was only after the '73 war, starting in the '67 war and then the '73 war, that the U.S. became a major supplier of weapons to Israel. Before '67, the U.S. had no military ties with Israel. In fact, a lot of the Israeli conventional weapons came from Czechoslovakia, which makes excellent machine guns, like that. And why did they do that? Because the Russians told them to do it. Why the Russians told them to do it? Because the Soviets were of the belief there were so many Jewish socialists fleeing Europe that they were going to build a communist state in the Middle East. It was just going to be the beginning of the spread of communism throughout the Middle East. Didn't work out that way. So the Israelis are very, practical. If you'll sell, I'll buy from you. If you'll sell, I'll buy from you. Neither you sell, I'll build it myself. And they have a very substantial indigenous capability. So anyway, that's been kind of isolation. Israel is the only country that neither confirms nor denies it has nuclear weapons. And I told you the kind of quizzical Golda Meir remark once from a prime minister. She said, "We will not be the first in the Middle East to get nuclear weapons, but we will not be the second either." Figure out what the hell that means. To other countries that went down the nuclear route with relatively limited U.S. response is India and Pakistan. India, I told you, had detonated the device in '74, the peaceful nuclear explosion right on the border with Pakistan, just to say we love you. And that clearly helped stimulate a program that the Pakistanis were interested in starting anyway by Ali Bhutto, who was a very charismatic Pakistani president, later executed by his successor, Zia Ben Haq. Then neither side moved forward very much, and then there was a sprint in the 90s, and then they both detonated in May of '98, and they both declared themselves as nuclear weapons states. Neither country had ever signed the NPT. These three countries, Israel, Pakistan, and India, were the three major countries that never signed the NPT. So they're not committing any violation of international law because they're not bound by the treaty. You could have 190 countries sign it, but if I don't sign it, I'm not part of the deal, I'm not violating anything. And we know that this produces tremendous domestic support. People are very proud that the country has been able to build and detonate nuclear weapons, so that's one reason. It helps strengthen the political regime under which this happened. It also tends to deter conflict in their region. It's a regional issue. This is, they're building weapons, nothing to do with the U.S. Soviet. It's about their own regional issues and problems. So that hasn't changed, and all three countries are moving forward with their nuclear arsenals. Particularly troublesome, some think, is the Pakistani program because they're building very large numbers of tactical nuclear weapons, short-range deliverable nuclear weapons. One of the fears, I think, did I tell you the scenario about India and Mumbai and all that, or did I not do that? So here's one of the great concerns in Washington, and it's not only in Washington, is that, remember Mumbai, Pakistani terrorists went into Mumbai, killed a lot of people, and the Indian government took tremendous heat but did not retaliate. In this scenario, there's a Mumbai repeat, another city somewhere, and people are killed. I think well, maybe I didn't mention to you, this is really captivating, terrifying account of Fareed Zakaria from CNN, Indian American, very smart guy, trained at Yale and Harvard. He gained access to the Indian communications intercepts of the Pakistani handler instructing the Pakistani terrorists what to do. And you actually could watch it, it's on HBO, you can watch it on your computer right now. And a key phrase the man says in English to them, he says, remember why you are there. These are 18 young guys in Mumbai. You are there to kill as many women and children as quickly as you can, and then to be killed yourself. That's why you're there. Don't forget it. And they all were killed, except for one who was arrested, and then he's ultimately executed. I think he was just executed. I don't know. So the worrisome scenario is, there's a repeat. More people are killed. India, especially with the new prime minister, is not going to sit there and just play tiddlywinks. He's going to order Indian conventional forces into Pakistan to destroy where these guys are coming from. The Pakistani army has never been able to hold its own against the Indian army. Pakistan knows this. The contingency plan is if Indian forces cross the border, Pakistan uses short-range tactical nuclear weapons on their own territory to kill Indian soldiers. And then India responds with a major nuclear attack, and the whole thing is a catastrophe. So that's a scenario, and there are variations of that. This is a deep concern in Washington. There's been a lot of discussion at high levels in government. The U.S. has had high level discussion with both governments about cooling it. But the Indians are piling up, the Pakistanis are piling up very large numbers of weapons that appear to be intended just for this purpose. So, other than that, things are great. So the India-Pakistani-Israel situation is sort of a done deal, and they're nuclear weapons states. Except Israel doesn't claim it is a nuclear. So then that leaves our two other problem children at the moment, North Korea and Iran. So we tried with North Korea an arms control agreement, which became the agreed framework. And this was completed by Clinton in 1994. And the whole point was to stop the plutonium reprocessing for weapons-grade material and the bomb program in North Korea in return for energy and economic aid and so forth. But then in 2002, the North Koreans revealed to Sig Hecker, who was former Los Alamos director and now at CSAC at Stanford, that they in fact had a separate uranium enrichment program and were piling up large amounts of weapons-grade material to enrichment, even though they had stopped the reprocessing. And this led to more severe economic sanctions. Economic sanctions have become the first weapon of choice in U.S. counterproliferation. I've gone now from strategic, which is largely U.S.-Soviet, to non-proliferation, to counterproliferation. So non-proliferation is stop before they get it. Counterproliferation is, try to roll with that. And things have gone from bad to worse. In U.S.-North Korean relations, we've now had 4 nuclear tests by North Korea. The last one was just in January, which they claimed was a thermonuclear weapon, but is, by all accounts, not a thermonuclear weapon. And nobody really knows how many weapons they have. They have 6, 12, or something. And more worrisome is that they're building longer-range missiles to carry them, including maybe right to the Berkeley campus, which would definitely, adjust our syllabus. We have to rethink our syllabus.
Berkeley's still a nuclear-free zone.
That's right, we're in a nuclear zone, so presumably Kim Jong-un knows that. It's a very good point. I'm sure he'd take that into account. He's a very thoughtful, pleasant fellow. So economic sanctions have been used now. We just ratcheted up economic sanctions. Now the Security Council just passed in the last week much more advanced economic sanctions. Because basically the only way you can give them any pain is if the leadership can't buy whatever they're trying to buy. Gucci Lopez or single malt scotch or whatever it is they like, and piling up a lot of money in Macau banks and so forth and so on. If you can stop that, then they might change their mind. Fortunately, we know, Kim Jong-un has done some really nasty things. He killed his uncle, his father's brother, who had close ties with the Chinese and may have had elements of the armies reporting to him. There's a rather hair-raising rumor that the South Koreans passed around for a while. It turned out not to be true, which is he was definitely executed. So the question was, how was he executed? And the initial reports from South Korea, claimed from intelligence sources, was that they had starved a bunch of dogs, and they put the uncle in this arena by himself, and they opened the door, and out ran the dogs. And within half an hour, there was no trace of the uncle. He had literally been eaten alive. Sorry, this is just... But that has been disproved. People say, no, that's just South Koreans making it up. I actually spoke to a U.S. North Korean person who knows what's going on there. And he said, no, that's absolutely not true. He was executed. How was he executed? And this gentleman said he was executed with a howitzer. This definitely can ruin your day. Get some big artillery shell. It's going to give you a bad headache. It's not going to be good. Current estimates are that Kim Jong-un has executed 70 top party and military officials since he's been in power in the last 2 years, which some claim is a sign of his great weakness and that he's terrified he's going to be overthrown in any minute. Others claim it shows that he can keep doing this for the next 200 years. He's in his early 30s, married to an actress, overweight, very limited intelligence, bad situation. Will the regime stay coherent? Will it fall apart? Lots of issues with the South Koreans and with the Chinese. It's a whole separate deal. And then we have our Iranian friends. Now we have this agreement, which you're going to study to death, maybe literally to death. And there's an effort to cap their program, to deny them movement for 10 or 15 years towards nuclear weapons. And I won't talk about that because you're the expert. You're going to make it. One thing is to say that when Clinton was president, the current Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, was an Assistant Secretary of Defense, and Bill Perry was the Secretary of Defense, and they wanted a lot of action on the non-proliferation front, but the State Department runs it because it's all these treaties. So in the bureaucratic competition, they invented the term counterproliferation and said, we have to use tough measures that only the Defense Department can use to counter them by arming our allies and stuff like that. And that's now developed. So we have 20 years of counterproliferation in defense and non-proliferation in the State Department. And I lived through that when I was in the Defense Department. So that's roughly where we stand. There's no happy bottom lines in any of this, but at the moment, no nuclear weapons have been used. And the spread has been much slower than expected. C.P. Snow, famous British writer and scientist, claimed that there would be 20 or 30 nuclear weapon states by the end of the 60s. And there were only, depending upon how you count, the 5 declared members, the 3 outside the treaty is 8, North Korea is 9, and Iran is, in limbo. So maybe 10. But you have other problems. One I slipped in here as an example is the Budapest Agreement. The Budapest Agreement. In 1994, after the Soviet Union had collapsed, in 92, we found several other countries from the former Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. So we didn't want those countries to have nuclear weapons. Better let Russia have more. I mean, what difference does it make if they have another 50, another 100, another 200? If they've got, thousands. But Hungary said, what? If we give up our nuclear weapons, the Russians will come, I'm sorry, I keep saying Hungary, Ukraine. Ukraine said, if we give up our weapons, the Russians will visit us again. I remember being in one part of Europe, and they said, we speak a lot of German. I said, what do you speak German? Because they're always visiting us. They're always visiting us, so you have to learn to speak German. So the same thing in that part of the world. The Russians keep visiting them. So the U.S. and the Russian Federation and Britain signed an agreement, not a treaty, the Budapest Agreement, guaranteeing Ukrainian sovereignty and giving them economic and energy assistance if they gave up their nuclear weapons and returned to Russia. So the Ukrainians did, and it worked okay. And then in 2000, when was it? 14. Well, Crimea in 2014. They lost Crimea, and now they've got all these little green men running around in eastern Ukraine. One of my favorite lines was he used to be a top comedian, he's now retired, David Letterman, who was once asked, who are these little green men? And Letterman said, well, Putin says they're not Russian soldiers. He says, I believe him. He said, why wouldn't I believe him? He said, it's seen those uniforms. He says, you think they're United Parcel Service delivery men? It's my kind of humor. It's really simple. And with the Iranian business, new questions arise. Will nuclear weapons come to the Middle East? Will they come to Egypt? Will they come to the Saudis? Saudis could probably buy them from Pakistan, an Islamic country, to another. Will they come to Turkey? So it's a full-time job to work these issues, diplomatically, politically, economically, militarily. And the theme of the Bracken book, if you get into it, is the second nuclear age is an age of regional nuclear competition. It's no longer about the big U.S.-Soviet thing. It's about India-Pakistan. It's about Israel-Iran. It's about South Korea-North Korea. This is the new age, and that's bad news. So we have real, deep hostilities between regional states with one or more armed nuclear weapons, and that's not good. Any other corrections?
So because of the Crimea invasion, doesn't that kind of set a bad precedent for these future treaties with regional power giving up nuclear weapons? Because
absolutely.
Because it just shows like if you're nukes, you can so other countries come back in.
Right. Exactly. And not only that, I'll give you 1 second. Not only that, after Gaddafi gave up his weapons, the U.S. had a no-fly zone and, facilitated his removal. So others say, the lesson is you give up your nuclear weapons, the Americans come visit you. So no, why should we give them up? In fact, in Iraq, it was stated. In fact, there was an Indian general who said the lesson of the Iraq war is don't give up nuclear weapons or the Americans will visit you. Yes, ma'am.
It was just a comment that it also coincided with Ukraine attempting to enter NATO.
Well, attempted European Union. They hadn't been admitted to NATO. They were not yet on the list, but they might.
It was on the table.
Certainly from Moscow's perspective, they were headed in that direction.
Yeah,
So this is very, Ukraine, I think the term for Ukraine in Russian is, it's sort of like backyard. I mean, it's intimate. I think the Duchy of Muscovy and the Russian Tsardom actually began here. So this is, some say, don't think that Putin's on the march. Ukraine's a special case. Others say baloney. It's just the first of many cases. Up to you guys to decide. let's hope we don't get any data during the rest of the semester. Let's continue the theoretical debate. Okay, thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Good luck on the exam, and then there'll be another session at the end, last hour. of the exam, right?